Hello, I'm John David Ebert, and welcome to this sort of introductory primer, a sort of John David Ebert 101, which we'll spend 8 classes going through my basic ideas and my basic way of orientation to the world, which is that of metaphysics. And so the theme of this sort of introductory video will be the question, what is metaphysics? Because that word can be confusing, and it has several different senses of application. So we'll go over that. Metaphysics is my primary area of expertise. In my most previous life, I was a surgeon, actually. So note that in that life, I mastered the physical realm, the realm of biology, the body. And so by the law of karmic balancing, it makes perfect sense that I would come back now to do the same thing, only with the metaphysical world. I operate on the metaphysical world. That's just my karma through the law of karmic balancing. And in subsequent videos, we'll get to how I figured out who I was in a past life and how all that works and fits together. And also we'll look at my cosmology of the afterlife so far, what I found out with based upon all my researches regarding the other side, reincarnation, karma, and the afterlife, and the sort of map that I'm still in the process of creating of it. And so, which leads us to point number 1, which is to say that every metaphysics presupposes an ontology. And an ontology simply means a theory of entities. Ontology. So it's a theory of entities. And it's a little different from a cosmology in the sense that a cosmology presupposes an ontology. You can't have one without the other. The ontology is a theory of being, a theory of the way in which beings are in the world, which then that theory enables you to create a cosmological map. If your ontology is spiritual, you're going to have a different cosmological map, a mythological cosmological map, than say the map that we have nowadays, where spirituality is dismissed and disregarded, and we have this ridiculous atheistic map of the universe that's based on a kind of Stephen Hawking joke of the world as a giant balloon that's just inflating, and all of his cosmological ideas, which are very shallow and empty. They may be correct on the physical plane, but now this leads to the second point, which is to say that metaphysics means after physics. It originally referred to Aristotle's corpus, in which the metaphysics came after his treatise called Physics. So we have his treatise Physics, and the metaphysics simply meant the one after it. But it also means a theory in the transcendent sense, that we have a theory about the world that is transcendent of the merely physical plane and which organizes the physical world. Whereas in shallow scientific theories, all you're getting is this idea, that this reduction of spirituality to a flat, sort of flatland view of the physical world. The world is much more than just the physical plane. The physical plane is the lowest level of the physical world, just as it was for Plotinus in the Egyptian philosopher from about 200 to 250 AD, who wrote the Enneads in Alexandria, where he pictures the earth basically as the core of the universe with various layers around it, almost like he were an Egyptian priest mummifying a body. Plotinus mummifies the world. We have the outermost realm of the One, which is the realm of the, similar to in Indian philosophy, Brahman, which is the non-dual realm beyond which there are no dualities. And then beneath that we have nous, which is Greek for mind. So we have the world of the mind, and then that inflects into the world of the anima mundi, which is the soul of the world that moves. The anima mundi is incorruptible. Nous, the cosmic mind, is incorruptible but static, whereas the anima mundi is incorruptible but dynamic. It's in motion. It has to do with the planets actually whirling around the earth, which then becomes the lowest world on this plane. Plotinus's cosmogony, or his cosmology rather, is basically correct. A cosmogony, by the way, is a theory of the origins. It's a myth that accounts for the origins of a particular cosmology. So those are two different things. So the earth basically, or rather let's say the physical plane is the lowest level. It vibrates at a very low, slow, dense frequency. It's long wave. Whereas the spiritual realm, the realm of, let's say, the other side, vibrates at a very rapid, high frequency level. That's the primary difference between them. And there are boundaries between the lowest level, the physical level that we're incarnate on temporarily, and the higher levels, and within that other side, there are levels within that as well, as we'll get into. There are interdimensional planes between this realm and that realm that make it difficult for us to get access to the other side. We can't remember our past lives unless we do something like undergo hypnotic regression, which I've done actually, and does enable you to retrieve some memories of your past lives, but it's not as neat and clean as I would like it to be. I always prefer order, form, and discipline, organization. I have Saturn as my highest planet on my birth chart, so I always prefer the disciplined approach, the formal approach. So, all right, then moving along then in this discussion, we also have to look at the word metaphysics because it has three basic different senses, and the first two are in diametric opposition. The first one, let's say, is the easiest one. When you walk into a Barnes & Noble, there's the metaphysical section, and you know you're going to find in that section metaphysics as kitsch, a derided, vulgarized, new age, popularized version of metaphysics, where you'll find books on crystals, chakras, astrology, near-death experiences, and what have you, shamanism maybe in there, all that kind of stuff that just gets lumped into one category. That's extremely popular. It's normally one of the best-selling sections in that bookstore. So there's metaphysics in that cheap, vulgar, tawdry sense. Then there's the opposite to that, which is metaphysics at the level of high philosophy, high philosophical discourse, which Heidegger then, and we'll be talking about Heidegger a lot here, which Heidegger then defines for us. He creates this idea of what he calls the metaphysical age, which extends from Plato, and we'll see why he doesn't include the pre-Socratic philosophers in this, which goes from Plato all the way down to Nietzsche. That period is the metaphysical age, which is to say high conceptual thinking. It doesn't necessarily mean have anything to do with reincarnation, karma, or knowledge of the other side. It just has to do with high conceptual thinking. Even an atomist hypothesis can be a form of metaphysics within this high conceptual academic world. And for that, it might be easier to understand it the way Francis Bacon gives us. Francis Bacon, who is contemporary with Shakespeare, and is one of the first materialist philosophers in the West, it does take Aristotle's four different types of causes and divides them neatly into physical causes and metaphysical causes. So the physical causes are what we might call material causes and efficient causes. A material cause, let's take a couch, is what the couch is made up out of, just as the world is made up out of atoms in this theory. Although for Aristotle, it's made up out of the four elements, not atoms. The atomistic hypothesis was brought in with Democritus and Leucippus, so it's a different view. Still metaphysical, though, because the atomist type, we're dealing with things we cannot see. Atoms are inferred in the philosophical tradition until they were proven, I think around the end of the 19th century, as actually existing, although they turn out to be much more complex. They're units of force consistent with Faustian civilization rather than little billiard balls knocking against each other on a pool table in the great philosophical tradition. So we have the thing out of which a thing is made, and then how it is made is the efficient cause. The guy who made the couch made it in a certain way. He used certain tools, certain kinds of materials, and he brought that thing into being in an efficient cause. It's an instrumental cause that imposes form on matter. Form and matter are crucial in Aristotle. And then we have the metaphysical causes, according to Francis Bacon, in the high philosophical sense, which has to do with the formal and final causes. The formal cause of that couch is the idea of making a couch that I had in my mind. If I'm the guy who made the couch, I just came up with the idea, oh, this is what we'll do, a thing for people to sit on comfortably, maybe 2 or 3 people. So that's the formal cause, and then the final cause is, what is the couch for? It's its telos, its goal. It's for sitting. It's for people to lounge and just sit around on in coffee shops, maybe in New York. They have a lot of those kinds of coffee shops with couches. So that's the distinction, and it's a handy one to keep in mind, that physics has to do with ontologies regarding the physical world, efficient and material causes, which is quite congenial to atomism, whereas formal and final causes are not. Because with formal and final causes, we have to start invoking a higher level of metaphysics that involves purpose, goal, seeing things as purposive. The acorn comes into being with the purpose of becoming a tree. It has a goal, a telos. So the question became in histories of evolution regarding whether evolution has a telos, a goal, as Derrida in the phenomenon of man believes that it does. It's moving toward an omega point, which is the Christification of matter, according to Derrida. And so those are the distinctions to keep in mind within the high realm of metaphysical discourse, even though we're still dealing with things like material and efficient causes within that higher level order of philosophy, from Plato to Nietzsche. The metaphysical age comes crashing down with Nietzsche, who brings it, he's almost Western philosophy's first deconstructionist. It all comes crashing down, and Heidegger comes along like a janitor with a broom and sweeps up all the pieces into his idea of being. So that, now, Derrida, we should mention Derrida's idea of deconstruction here because it's important, because it represents the end of the metaphysical age. Heidegger does too, to a certain extent. But what Derrida calls the logocentric age is the same thing as what Heidegger refers to as the metaphysical age, because Derrida was a Husserl and Heidegger scholar. He's impossible to understand without knowledge of either one of those guys. And so the idea here is that, and he calls it logocentric because it privileges the logos, reason, rationality. And in doing so, what it does is it sets up a series of metaphysical bivalent oppositions between polarities. We have man, woman. We have nature, culture. We have speech versus writing. So we have the West. The Western metaphysical system is built up on the tension that is generated between these pairs of opposites. But the key with Derrida is that one of these opposites is always privileged over the other. Man is privileged over woman. Culture is privileged over nature. The voice is privileged over writing, which is a bit of a surprise. You would think it would be the opposite, but the reason the voice is privileged over writing in the West is because it's closer to archai. It's closer to the actual origin, which is, of course, what drives the West's madness for first editions. Oh, it's closer to the archai. A first edition of Gravity's Rainbow is closer to Thomas Pynchon than later crappy reprints. And what Derrida does then is go in and to undermine the structure of the whole ontology of the Western metaphysical age by showing that actually the opposition is false because the one can be found in the other. Speech, he says, is kind of form of writing. It's archy writing. It's primordial writing because it's based on spacing out, organizing thoughts and words in your mind as you're speaking, as I'm speaking. I'm doing a kind of primordial writing. So the two are contained within each other, therefore they collapse. Same thing with nature, culture. Culture is contained within nature to a certain extent, nature within culture to a certain extent. So he goes through and he shows how these opposites are actually contained within one another and aren't so, as much of an opposition as we think, and therefore they collapse. And when opposites collapse, what you get is entropy. You get a thermodynamic equilibrium where there's no longer any potential to power the system anymore. Systems are powered by differentials, as a heat engine in thermodynamics is powered by the differential between hot and cold. When the particles in that system slowly intermix with each other, the faster moving ones are hot, the slower moving ones are cold, but when they intermix, you get thermodynamic equilibrium, maximum entropy, in other words. And so we started getting theories in our cosmology of the 19th century about the universe headed for a universal heat death, an achievement of maximum entropy, because heat always runs from the hotter bodies to the colder bodies. So everything always cools down eventually. So, okay, so that's, let's see, Derrida. And Heidegger's idea then, back to Heidegger, is his idea that there is a history of being. Being for Heidegger is his primary metaphysical idea. And for him, being is that which makes intelligible within a culture, within a particular epoch, how things are understood. It's a kind of a priori presupposition of how things will reveal themselves in a particular age. So he says that as we go back over the history of being, and philosophy for Heidegger is the history of philosophy. This is one of the Greek philosophers, Cornelius Castoriadis's criticisms of him, that he reduces philosophy to the history of philosophy. And in a sense, even though Heidegger read Spengler, He did not retain Spengler's, what Spengler calls a Copernican revolution, which we'll look at next time. He maintains the Ptolemaic idea that history moves from ancient, medieval to modern, more or less. So it follows that scheme, even though he's fully aware of Spengler and liked him. Nonetheless, so what we have, the earliest idea of being is being as phusis, P-H-Y-S-I-S, from which, of course, we get physics. Phusis, though, as the Greek pre-Socratics like Thales and Anaximander and Anaximenes, all these kind of guys, phusis is being as a flashing forth of entities that simply manifest themselves briefly. They flash forth, they become apparent, and they dissolve and disappear. So it's this flashing forth, dissolving, and disappearing of entities. All the autonomy is on the entity, not the subject. It's rarely on the subject in Greek philosophy. They didn't really discover the subject the way we do. Everything, starting with Descartes, shifts to subjective philosophy. The subject, the transcendental subject, becomes the key thing, all the way down to Nietzsche and Heidegger. And so this idea is Heidegger's idea, which he talks about in his essay on what is the essence of truth, or the essence of truth, where he says, now truth for him isn't a matter like it was for the classical age, the metaphysical age, of binarity. Something is either true or false. It's not the case for Heidegger. It's more a matter of degree, because it has this idea that entities arise. This is his idea, what he uses the Greek term aletheia. Entities arise from a clearing, or into a clearing, rather. This is analogized to a forest. A lot of Heidegger's metaphors are taken from forests. You're in the depths of the woods and you come to a clearing. Sunlight on the grass. Things become evident there that weren't evident back in the darkness of the woods. But a clearing is simply the space of encounter between entities. The epistemological, that is to say the knowledge world, where things are made evident. And when things come into being or reveal their characteristics, they unconceal is the term he uses for aletheia. They unconceal themselves. Every time they do that, they reveal only certain facets of themselves, because the rest of that entity is turned away from us. So there's only ever a certain amount that we're getting to know about this entity at any given time. And once it flashes forth and we see it, Heidegger is basically retrieving this earliest Greek idea of being as phusis and bringing it back into the modern world, where the autonomy returns to the thing, the subject, not the mind, the subject. And every time it unconceals one side of itself, it simultaneously conceals another side. So we're never getting the full truth. We're just getting a truth about this entity that we're examining. Every time we put a different question to an entity or an object or a thing, it unconceals certain facets, but automatically makes others drop off the radar. So we're never getting the full story. So this is the Greek idea. It's very similar to the Greek idea of phusis. And then with Plato, we get phusis, or rather being as eidos, the eidolons, which are the Platonic forms, which are the ultimate archai, from which everything on the temporal plane is merely a copy, a weak shadow copy of the ultimate archai. All the horses that you see out there, those are all more or less poor genetic copies of the horse idea as a form, as an archetype, which somehow is transcendent now to the world. And Heidegger didn't like this. This is why he regards Plato as the beginnings of the fall of philosophy, whereas we typically think of Plato and Aristotle as its peak, as its apogee, from the Greek period anyway. He sees it as a fall because what he liked about the pre-Socratics was being for them was immanent in the world. It was in the world. With Plato, it's transcendent. So as Nietzsche says of Plato, Christianity is just popularized Platonism. It's transcendentalism in another form. So being there becomes eidos. With Christianity, being becomes this idea of logos. And the thing that Heidegger objects to about Christianity is that it collapses logos, which means, in Heraclitus it meant logos, it means reason, but it had a cosmological dimension to it with Heraclitus, which meant a cosmic principle by way of which things are ordered. That's the logos, as Heraclitus as a pre-Socratic meant it. But for the Christians, for Christianity, being becomes collapsed and identified with a being, one being, the Christ being, was the word logos, the word made flesh. And so Heidegger didn't like this idea of the collapsing of being. It leads to the forgetting of being. And then we get to the Middle Ages, and the idea of being there is, that is true, which is true in the mind of God. And whether we're talking about St. Anselm or St. Thomas Aquinas, everything that is true is anchored by archetypes that are in the mind of God. So there's these ultimate archetypes, and you're always getting closer to them or further away from them. But the idea is truth is that God is the ultimate transcendental signified. To borrow a term from Derrida, for those signifieds that anchor all the other signifiers that are moving around and orders them, that is the medieval conception of being. And then finally, and we'll finish this video here, we'll need to continue some of it elsewhere, but we'll finish it here with this idea of being as Vorhandenheit, which comes in now, starting with Descartes and going down pretty much to right about the year 1900, right in there, where being is this idea of self-sufficient entities, which are in a transcendent XYZ phase space, a three-dimensional Cartesian phase space, and these vectors come in with Descartes and his fusion of algebra with geometry. So we get these XYZ axes, height, depth, width, and within this phase space that is deep, this is one of my favorite words of Heidegger, that is de-worlded from the world. It's like Plato's ideas in a certain sense. It's de-worlded, it's not in the world. It exists in here, in a mathematical vectorial phase space, where all entities now, when we plug them into this phase space, we can denude them of locality, denude them of all of their local, concrete, tangible properties, and get objective properties. We can find out what the primary qualities are in philosophy according to John Locke: motion, figure, rest, solidity, shape, all these objective factors. Galileo becomes obsessed with these what are called primary qualities in philosophy, these objective factors that enable us to create science. Now it's objective. But Heidegger's objection to Vorhandenheit of self-sufficient entities is that they need to be put back in the world. The jug on the table that is put into vectorial phase space for its absolute qualities of mass and volume has nothing to do now with the jug's history and maybe the significance of that jug as having a spiritual significance of pouring water, and the act of pouring water as a libation that is connected with the spiritual world and the locality of where this face has come from. It's basically an ahistorical picture, this vectorial phase space of Vorhandenheit. And Heidegger has an allergy toward mathematics. His primary teacher, Husserl, was a mathematician, and a lot of Heidegger is based on a rebellion against Husserl, just as Jung rebelled against Freud. And so then we get down to being as in framing, Gestell, which is Heidegger's understanding of technology in the modern world. What it does is it sort of creates a frame around the world where everything is looked at as a potential resource for exploitation of energy. You don't look at that mountain over there because it's beautiful. You look at it because, oh, there might be uranium in there that we can mine out of there, or copper or gold or silver, and use that, extract it from that to create energy potentials. The river, the Rhine, let's say, the beauty of going down the Rhine is then transformed by Gestell and framing into building a hydroelectric dam across that river, storing up the energy in that river with that dam to be used for energy resource at a later time. So Heidegger sees technology in a very negative sense as doing damage to the world and as creating the world as basically a framework of energy. Once again, it's another form of de-worlding the world. It doesn't take locality or significance, spiritual or symbolic significance into account. And so his idea of being is more like being as phusis, he's very concerned with being as something that is immanent, concrete, in the world, that has to do with place and time and significance toward the individual. You as an individual already, and this is his idea of Dasein, Sein is being, but now Dasein is being there, being there. You are a particular human. And already when we catch up to you, you already have a pre-philosophical understanding, a naive understanding of what it is that you're supposed to do. As a farmer, as a technician, as a craftsman, you already know what you have a pre-philosophical understanding of what your being there-ness is. And so the human being he refers to as Dasein, a being who is not out there like a Kantian abstract self, a transcendental unity of apperception floating around in Vorhandenheit phase space, but you are a particular individual embedded in a particular time and a particular place in a particular locale with a particular predisposition to do something very particular. So you're embedded concretely in a world, World is another key term for Heidegger. You're in a world horizon. All right, so that brings us up to where we'll stop here for our first video on what is metaphysics. And perhaps, I think maybe part 2 we'll continue with metaphysics. There's a lot more to cover, so we'll do part 2, metaphysics part 2 next.